The lights dimmed. The soft murmur of the audience faded into a heavy silence, the kind that only lived within the walls of a great concert hall. Elijah Ward stood still at the center of Carnegie Hall's grand stage, every fiber of his tailored tuxedo rigid with precision. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, not out of nerves, but reverence. He had been here before, many times, but tonight was different. The orchestra awaited his signal, bows poised, breath held. They trusted him. And why shouldn't they? He was Elijah Ward, the maestro of modern symphony, the first black conductor to win the Richter International Prize, the man whose fingers could paint landscapes with Beethoven and stir tempests with Mahler. He raised his baton. A heartbeat later, the first notes of Beethoven's Symphony No. 7 shimmered into the air. The violins lifted like sunlight spilling across a lake. The cellos answered with a depth that tugged at memory and marrow. Elijah moved not like a man, but like a vessel, each motion of his arms translating invisible emotion into visible sound. He lived for this. Each movement was a conversation between past and present, between struggle and triumph, between who he was and what the world had made him of. But as the third movement swelled to its peak, something sharp pierced the atmosphere. At first, Elijah thought it was a discordant note, but it wasn't. It was inside him. A high-pitched whine, shrill and splitting, bloomed behind his eyes and surged through his skull. His baton faltered for just a beat, just long enough for the concertmaster to glance up. Then came the silence. Elijah blinked. The orchestra played on. He could see it, the bows moving, the timpani vibrating, but it all happened in complete, terrifying stillness. His hands still moved, but the music no longer followed him. He couldn't hear it. Not a note. Not a whisper. For the first time in 43 years, Elijah Ward experienced a world without sound. The review in the Times the next morning called the performance hauntingly poignant. They didn't know. No one did. Elijah had finished the piece through muscle memory and sheer instinct. He had bowed at the end, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, panic blooming just beneath his smile. The audience had stood, applauded, cried. But Elijah had heard none of it. He didn't return to the green room. He didn't take the elevator. He didn't speak to the board of trustees or his agent or the wide-eyed first violinist who looked like she'd just witnessed a miracle. He walked. Straight out of the stage door, down the rain-slicked sidewalk of 57th Street, past the honking taxis and umbrella-holding tourists. He walked into the storm. Thunder rolled overhead. He felt the vibrations more than he heard them. Somewhere along the avenue he vomited. His head throbbed with a nauseating echo, a ghost of sound, as if his brain was clinging to whatever scraps it could find. By the time he reached his penthouse overlooking Central Park, Elijah was soaked, shaking, and silent. The audiologist confirmed what he already feared. Profound sensorineural hearing loss, she said gently, as if wrapping the words in silk would somehow soften the blow. It appears sudden, but there may have been signs earlier. Tinnitus? Sensitivity to high frequencies? He nodded numbly. There had been signs, but he had ignored them. Because geniuses don't get sick. Because black men in high places don't have the luxury of frailty. Because he was Elijah Ward. He asked if it would come back. The doctor hesitated. It's possible, but unlikely. Not without intervention. Cochlear implants, perhaps, but even then, it would not be the same. Elijah looked out the window. The city bustled below, full of noise and chaos and life. All of it beyond his reach. Days turned to weeks. Calls came and went. Emails piled up. Interview requests. Letters from fans. Concerned messages from former students. Elijah responded to none of them. He lived inside his silence.
He walked the apartment at night, barefoot, tracing the same paths over and over, from piano to window, from bookshelf to fireplace. The piano, his Steinway, stood untouched. One morning, while sorting old programs and scores, he found a letter wedged between the pages of a composition notebook. The envelope was hand-addressed, slanted cursive, ink smudged. He opened it. Elijah, if you're reading this, you're probably in pain, and I'm sorry for that. But maybe it's time. Come home. The center could use someone like you. The kids could. I know you think you left that place behind, but some places stay with us whether we like it or not. Besides, there's a girl here, Naomi, 11 years old, plays the violin like it's part of her soul. You should meet her. Love, Ruth. Ruth, his sister. He hadn't seen her in over a decade, not since their mother's funeral, not since they'd fought about his decision to stay in the city, not since he'd told her Riverside was a town meant for silence, and that he was meant for more. He held the letter in his lap. Naomi, 11. Violin. The image took root. He stood up, slowly, walked to the piano, opened the lid, pressed a key. No sound. But the vibration under his finger was real. And so he packed a bag. 3 days later, Elijah Ward boarded a train bound south. He didn't know what he was going to find in Riverside, but he knew, somehow, that silence had not come to destroy him. It had come to teach him something new.
The train pulled into Riverside Station just past noon, slicing through the stillness of a southern summer. The platform hadn't changed in 20 years. Same peeling green benches, same faded mural of the town's history painted on the station wall, half hidden by ivy. As Elijah stepped off the train, duffel bag in hand, the thick air wrapped around him like a memory. He paused for a moment, absorbing the soundless landscape. A bird flapped past, its wings cutting the air, and he saw, not heard, the way the wind stirred the leaves above. A young couple laughed nearby, but their joy reached him only through the curvature of their lips, the glimmer in their eyes. Ruth was waiting near the lot in a battered blue pickup truck. She didn't wave. She just watched, her arms crossed, an unreadable expression on her sun-browned face. Elijah. Her voice was soft, lips moving slowly so he could read them. He nodded. They embraced stiffly, years of silence sitting between them like extra luggage. The ride into town was mostly quiet. Ruth didn't try to talk. She just drove, her knuckles pale against the steering wheel, eyes scanning the road. Elijah watched the houses roll by. Wooden porches, American flags, kids running barefoot in yards that stretched like woven blankets. Riverside was smaller than he remembered, or maybe he had just grown too big for it. "You look tired," Ruth signed with one hand at a red light. The gesture was clumsy but genuine. They had both learned some sign language as kids, taught by their church's deaf pastor. Elijah nodded again. "I am," he mouthed. The house was still theirs. Their mother's old home stood at the edge of a field, flanked by 2 ancient oak trees. The screen door squeaked the same way it always had. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and dust. "You can have Mama's room," Ruth said as she carried his bag inside. "I kept it just like she left it." Elijah wandered to the living room. The family piano was still there, an old Wurlitzer upright with yellowed keys. He ran his hand along the wood, felt a key depressed beneath his finger, still tuned from the feel of it. "I've been keeping it up. Naomi uses it," Ruth said from the doorway. Elijah turned. "She plays more than just violin?" he asked, fingers spelling the words in rough American Sign Language. "She plays everything," Ruth replied. "But the violin, that's where her soul is." The next morning, Elijah walked down to the community center. It was a squat brick building next to the church, windows smudged, front garden half wild. Kids spilled out the doors, laughter echoing in waves. He could feel it on his skin, the hum of their energy, their noise, even if it didn't reach his ears. Inside, Ruth introduced him with a firm hand on his back. "This is my brother. He's here to help." Some of the staff looked skeptical. One woman, maybe in her 30s, crossed her arms. "He can't hear? How's he going to teach music?" Elijah simply nodded, then turned toward the piano in the far corner. He opened the lid, sat down, and began to play. It wasn't grand or loud. It was gentle, a slow rolling rendition of Amazing Grace that wrapped around the room like a whisper. He played by memory, by feeling, by faith. The room fell still. Even the children hushed. When he finished, a small voice said, "Do it again." He looked up. A girl stood there, about 11 years old, holding a violin case. Tight curls framed her face. Her eyes were wide, but steady. "You're Naomi," he said. She nodded. "I'm Elijah." She said, "I know." Naomi walked over to the piano and opened her case. She drew the bow across the strings, testing the tuning. Then, without a word, she began to play the melody he had just performed. It wasn't perfect, but it had soul. Elijah closed his eyes. He couldn't hear her, but somehow he felt every note.
The basement of Mount Bethel Church was not on any town brochure. Its cinder-block walls were painted beige decades ago and now bore the scars of time: chipped paint, moisture stains, the faint scent of mildew that clung even after scrubbing. But it was here, beneath creaking floorboards and gospel echoes, that something quietly beautiful was happening. It began with the beat of a plastic bucket. Elijah stood at the doorway, watching a boy of maybe 10 pound out a rhythm with wooden spoons. Around him, 4 other kids clapped and stomped along. There were no real instruments, just chairs, crates, toy drums, and an old tambourine missing half its jingles. The moment they saw Elijah, the rhythm stuttered. Ruth stood in the center, a whistle on a lanyard around her neck. "Don't stop," she said, using her hands and voice together. "Keep the beat going." The kids hesitated, glancing at the stranger in the doorway. Elijah stepped forward, raised both palms slowly, and clapped once, firm and flat. Then again, a steady 4/4, a pulse. The children watched. Then one by one, they joined in. The boy with the spoons picked up his beat. The girl with the crates slapped its sides. Naomi walked in a few moments later, violin case over her shoulder. She paused, surveyed the room, then took out her instrument. No sheet music, just instinct. She didn't wait. She played. The tune she chose was simple, folk-like, something born of porch-light evenings and rocking chairs. Elijah moved closer to her, nodded with the rhythm, and lifted his hands in slow, deliberate gestures, guiding tempo and dynamics without saying a word. The children leaned in, trusting him. By the end, the group was grinning, panting from the energy of it all. Elisha signed beautiful and pressed his palm to his heart. A few of the children copied the gesture, unsure but curious. After the session, Ruth pulled him aside. "They like you, even the quiet ones. That's something." He nodded, watching Naomi tuck away her violin. "This basement is all we've got," she said. "No funding, no teachers, just these kids, some broken chairs, and faith." Elijah looked around. The cracked linoleum, the sagging ceiling tiles, the rusted old water heater in the corner. And yet, there had been music here, real music. He scribbled a note on his pad and showed it to her. "What if we made this a real classroom?" Ruth exhaled a half laugh. "Then we'd need miracles." Elijah tapped his temple, then his chest. "We already have them." That night, Elijah sat at the Wurlitzer again. He pressed a chord,
couldn't hear it, but the vibration under his fingers told him it was there. He imagined the notes hovering in the air, unspoken but understood. Outside, cicadas sang in long, shimmering waves. He couldn't hear them either. But maybe, just maybe, he didn't need to. The next morning, he returned to the basement with a whiteboard, a set of flashcards, and the simple tools of rhythm: drumsticks, paper cups, feet, and breath. He drew quarter notes and rests, taught hand signs for tempo, used color and body to teach timing. Naomi caught on quickest, but even the boy with the spoons, whom he now knew as Jalen, showed remarkable instinct. At the end of the week, Elisha clapped his hands twice. The room silenced. Then he signed, "Want to make music without instruments?" The kids looked at each other, puzzled. Then he stamped his foot. Clap, clap, snap. Clap, clap, snap. One by one, they joined in. And the basement of the old church, forgotten, cracked, and low-ceilinged, came alive with a symphony of silence.
The kids came back. That was the first miracle. By Monday morning, Elijah walked into the church basement to find all 10 of them waiting, seated, fidgeting, curious. No one had made them come. No one had bribed or begged. They just showed up, their feet tapping, eyes expectant. He greeted them the same way he had the week before, with a beat. Clap, clap, snap. And again, clap, clap, snap. Jalen picked it up first, then Naomi, then 2 others. Soon the room echoed, that with instruments, but with presence, with attention. Elijah had brought a printed chart that morning, simple rhythms, large notes, quarter and half rests. He held it up, pointed to a measure, then performed it with his body. Thigh slap, chest tap, finger snap. He moved slowly, exaggerated. The kids laughed, but followed. He couldn't hear their sounds, but he could feel their timing, the sync, the stumbles, the way they leaned into the moment. For most of the group, this was their first real music lesson. For Elijah, it was his first, without sound. He taught rhythm with ropes and chalk, melody with color-coded stickers on keyboards, harmony through humming vibrations on wooden boxes they sat upon. Music became tactile, kinetic, visual, and the more the kids moved, the more they connected, not just to the lessons, but to each other. At the end of each day, Elijah wrote a message on the whiteboard. Music is not only heard, it is seen, felt, shared. Naomi stayed late. She didn't say much, but her presence was constant. She cleaned up chairs, she helped Jalen pack up his spoons. She watched Elijah with a kind of quiet reverence, as if trying to memorize not what he taught, but how he carried it. One afternoon, she waited until the others had gone before opening her violin case. "I want to show you something," she said. Elijah nodded, pulled a chair closer. She began to play a Bach partita. It was clumsy in some spots, too fast in others, but there was something deeper beneath the notes: urgency, ache, story. When she finished, she looked at him, searching. He signed slowly. "Why this piece?" She shrugged, eyes cast down. "My dad used to play it, before he left." Elijah swallowed hard. He wrote, "You play like you miss him. That's honest. That's music." She smiled, a rare, soft kind of smile. "I want to get better." She wrote again, "Then stay honest." By the end of the month, the basement resembled less a storage room and more a school. Elijah had arranged the folding chairs in a circle. Ruth found a white rug at a thrift store. Parents donated a box of old music books. One retired band teacher even dropped off a set of chimes. The kids had begun calling it the music circle. And in that circle, Elijah taught lessons the way he had always believed they should be taught, not with rigid rules, but with feeling, with truth, with the belief that even in silence, something beautiful could still be heard. And perhaps most unexpectedly of all, he had started to believe it himself.
The first time Elijah met Isaiah, the boy was sitting alone in the far corner of the basement, legs folded beneath him, tapping the same rhythm over and over again on the tile floor. It was fast, intricate, but precise. His eyes didn't lift when Elijah walked past. Ruth noticed. "That's Isaiah," she said, signing his name while she spoke. "He doesn't talk, hasn't since he was 4, nonverbal, but smart as a whip." Elijah nodded. He watched the boy's fingers move, left palm flat, right fingers dancing a cascade of syncopation. There was no hesitation, no searching. Music lived in this child's hands. Later that day, while the others worked on a group clapping pattern, Elijah sat beside Isaiah. He tapped a rhythm of his own, simple, repeating. Then he paused, waiting. Isaiah responded without looking up. His reply was a variation, same tempo, different texture. Elijah smiled. He tapped again, this time adding a thigh slap. Isaiah countered with a double tap and a knock on the wall. Back and forth they went, a conversation without voices, a duet without instruments. Elijah brought a small practice drum the next day. It was battered, but the head still held tension. He placed it gently in front of Isaiah. The boy looked at it, then at him. He didn't touch it. Elijah played first. 3 strokes, pause, 1 soft tap. He offered the drum. Isaiah placed both hands flat on its surface. Then, with deliberate grace, he answered. His playing was unlike anything Elijah had seen. Not just rhythm, but intention, story. He used his palms, fingertips, even the heel of his hand to create layers. When he was done, the room had stilled around him. Jalen whispered, "Dang." Isaiah looked up. He had heard that. Elijah knelt beside him, drew a small sign on his palm. "You're a drummer." He didn't react, but the next day he was waiting by the door before Elijah arrived. In the weeks that followed, Isaiah became the heart of the rhythm section. He never spoke, he barely smiled, but his hands spoke volumes. The other children began to watch him, to follow his lead. When Elijah demonstrated a complicated polyrhythm with claps and gestures, it was Isaiah who broke it down by example. He couldn't teach with words, but he taught with movement, with patience, with power. One afternoon, Naomi caught him sitting beside him, her violin case unopened. "She think he can hear the music?" she asked. Elijah nodded slowly. He wrote on the whiteboard, "He doesn't just hear it, he is it." She smiled. "I think I want to learn from him too." Elijah stayed late that night, watching Isaiah clean the drumhead with a cloth, his motions slow and deliberate. He tapped Elijah's wrist, then pointed to the whiteboard. He began to write. "My name is Isaiah. I don't talk, but I listen. I want to play everything." Elijah's throat tightened. He took the marker and wrote beneath it, "Then we'll help you play everything." The boy nodded once, then reached for the drum again. And just like that, the basement found its pulse.
Ruth Simmons had always believed in the power of quiet things, murmured prayers, shared glances, a child's hesitant first note. For years, she had worked in the margins of Riverside, organizing food drives, clothing swaps, and tutoring circles that operated with almost no budget, but plenty of heart. When the church's music basement opened its doors again, it became something more than she had ever dared hope for. It became her revolution. She watched the children gather each week with Elijah, with their mismatched instruments and worn-out shoes. But what she saw most was their transformation. Kids who once flinched at eye contact, now reaching out to harmonize. Teens who had been written off as troublemakers, now organizing sectionals. Ruth didn't see noise. She saw growth. One morning, she arrived early and sat in the folding chair she always avoided, the one near the heater that clicked every 10 seconds. She listened to the silence between clicks. It was a rhythm of its own. The children began to arrive in waves, Naomi with her violin, Isaiah with his drum, Jalen with his wild energy and half-tuned guitar. Ruth watched them interact, learning each other's silences as much as their sounds. She remembered the first time she met Elijah, all intensity and haunted eyes, as if he were trying to hold back a tidal wave of grief with sheer posture. Now he moved differently. Not lighter, but clearer. One Saturday, Ruth brought in a surprise. She carried it down the stairs with effort, a rusted metal case. When she opened it, Elijah's eyes widened. An old tape recorder, reel to reel. "I used to record choirs on this," she said, patting the lid. "No buttons to distract, no screens, just sound. Want to show them how to use it?" He nodded, reverently. Within minutes, the children circled around as Elijah explained the mechanics, the way the reels spun, the magnetic tape caught vibration, how sound could live in plastic. When they recorded their first session, a messy improv with wrong notes and unstoppable joy, Ruth sat at the back and wept quietly. It wasn't sorrow. It was revolution. She started keeping a notebook, not of music, but of moments. March 12. Naomi played in front of the group for the first time. She was shaking. Isaiah nodded twice when she finished. March 15. Jalen apologized to Micah without prompting. March 20th. Elijah smiled during warm-ups. Actual smile. It wasn't just about teaching music. It was about reclaiming voice, presence, worth. Ruth began to dream again, not just of keeping the basement alive, but of turning it into a real program, a foundation, a place with grants and visibility and a waiting list long enough to stretch down the block. The others saw a rusty basement. She saw a conservatory in disguise. She met with Pastor Hill. She typed up a proposal. She called the community college to ask about partnerships. Some said no, but one said maybe. And that was enough. The revolution, Ruth knew, didn't come with fanfare. It came with Isaiah's steady beat, Naomi's trembling high note, Elijah's silence softened, and her own unwavering faith that even the smallest sound could ripple outward until the whole city listened. And so, every time a child walked down those basement stairs, Ruth smiled to herself, because she knew the quietest revolutions were the ones that changed everything.
The alley behind Parker's pawn shop wasn't the kind of place you stopped in unless you had a reason or nowhere else to go. For most of Riverside, it was a shortcut at best, a threat at worst. But for Elijah, on one dusky Thursday evening, it became a portal. He had heard the sound before he saw the player. A saxophone, not polished, not smooth, but raw and honest. It groaned and climbed and cracked through the summer heat like a voice that hadn't spoken in years and forgot how to whisper. Elijah paused mid-step, groceries in hand, frozen by the sheer truth of the sound. In the alley's shadow stood a man, tall and wiry, dressed in layers that didn't suit the weather. His back leaned against a wall of graffiti, eyes closed, blowing life into brass. Elijah didn't know whether to interrupt or listen. He listened. The song ended. The man opened one eye and smirked. "You gonna stand there all day or you got something to say?" Elijah blinked. "You play real. That's rare." "Real's all I got left." He tucked the sax under his arm and nodded towards a crate. "Name's Curtis. You teach, don't you? Heard about that basement band?" Elijah sat slowly. "Yeah, we're trying to make something different." "Different's good, long as it ain't fake." There was silence again, comfortable, like two old trees rooted side by side. Curtis spoke first. "They got room for an alley sax?" Elijah grinned. "Depends. Can you follow a bunch of teenagers with passion and no sense of rhythm?" Curtis laughed, a full-bodied, scratchy laugh that echoed off the brick. "I've been following chaos my whole life, kid. Lead the way." That Saturday, Curtis walked into the church basement with a secondhand case and the smell of tobacco and time.
The kids stared, half curious, half suspicious. Isaiah whispered, "Whose grandpa is that?" Curtis opened the case. The saxophone caught the light, worn smooth by years. He said, "Let's jam." No instructions, no warm-ups, just soul. When he played, the room stilled. Even Jalen didn't fidget. Naomi blinked bow poised midair. Micah dropped his tambourine. They listened not to perfection, but to feeling. Curtis told stories with each breath, stories of alley nights and lost lovers, of wrong turns and long walks home. He played notes that Elijah never knew existed between the spaces of sheet music. Afterwards, the kids didn't applaud. They exhaled. Curtis became a fixture. Never said much, but his horn did. When Naomi struggled with fear, he played her courage. When Jalen ranted about being misunderstood, Curtis jammed the chaos until it danced. When Elijah hesitated, Curtis played forward. One evening, Ruth pulled Elijah aside. She asked, "Do you trust him?" Not out of suspicion, but care. Elijah nodded. "He reminds me that music ain't clean, and that's what they need." Curtis never claimed a title. He never asked for money. He just showed up, leaned against the wall, and waited for the first note to start. The alley had let him go. Now, the basement held him. And for the first time in a long while, Curtis blew his horn not just to survive, but to belong. That night, Elijah locked up late. He passed the same alley where it all began. It was empty now. But in the silence, he heard echoes. And he smiled, because some music didn't need an audience to be real. It just needed a place to land.
The first envelope arrived on a Monday. It was pale blue, the color of faded sky, tucked between bills and junk in Ruth's old mailbox. Her name was written in slanted cursive, the kind that carried memory in every curve. No return address, just a postmark from Detroit. She opened it slowly, as if it might disappear. Inside, one sheet of paper, one paragraph, one voice she hadn't heard in 2 years. "Dear Ruth, I don't know where to begin, so I'll start where we ended. I'm sorry. I was scared, not of you, but of who I was next to you. Music makes you brave. It made me a coward. I hope you're still playing. I hope you haven't forgotten me. Marcus." Ruth stared at the paper. Her hands trembled, not from anger, not from grief, just from remembering. Marcus, the boy with a bass voice and baby face, the one who wrote chords on napkins and swore jazz could fix anything. Her first duet, her first heartbreak. She hadn't forgotten. Elijah noticed the shift. Ruth was quieter than usual, not withdrawn, but just listening more, feeling out the corners of silence. Her solos grew softer, more reflective, like she was speaking to someone who wasn't in the room. He asked her one day, after rehearsal, "Everything okay?" She nodded. "Just thinking in letters." Elijah didn't press. He'd learned that music always gave the answers eventually. By week's end, a second letter arrived. Then a third. Each came with a different postmark: Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Philly. Each a little longer. Marcus writing his way across cities, chasing himself, it seemed. "Ruth, do you remember the alley behind Mr. Lee's, where we played for pizza slices and got chased by raccoons? I do. I remember everything. I thought forgetting would free me. It didn't. I joined a group in Baltimore. Nothing special. But there was this one night we played Naima under a broken street lamp, and I heard you in every note." Ruth folded each letter carefully and kept them in a music book, between pages of Coltrane and Ella, a quiet archive of an unfinished song. One night she brought them to the basement.
After rehearsal, she waited for everyone to leave, except Elijah. She said, "I want to play something." She laid the letters on the piano. Then she played. A melody shaped by longing, chords wrapped in apology, notes that bent like questions and resolved like forgiveness. Elijah watched in silence, hearing not just music, but history. When she finished, he didn't speak. She looked up. "I think he's coming back." Elijah nodded. "I think he already has." The last letter came with a train ticket. Marcus, coming home. The day was marked on Ruth's calendar with a small blue star. No words, just hope. And in the quiet that followed, the band rehearsed, not just for music, but for reunion, because some songs don't end. They just wait for the right hands to begin again.
The morning Marcus returned, Riverside was shrouded in fog. The train station platform hissed with the exhale of brakes, a gray ghost rolling in from a distant world. Ruth stood among strangers, her fingers tucked into the sleeves of her sweater, heart thudding like a drum roll. He stepped off the train wearing the same brown jacket, scuffed boots, and a saxophone case slung over his shoulder like a badge of regret. His eyes found hers before his feet did. "Hey," he said. Simple as that. Ruth didn't cry. She didn't speak. She walked forward and hugged him, just long enough to say everything letters couldn't. Back at the church basement, the band stared. "Is that?" Malik asked. Elijah grinned. "Yup, the prodigal tenor." Marcus nodded, setting his case down gently beside the drums. "I hear you've got room for a second sax." Ruth rolled her eyes, but a smile tugged at her lips. "We've got room for honesty." The room chuckled, tension cracking like old ice. They rehearsed with Marcus that night. His fingers rusty, his timing uneven, but his tone, that old golden tone, it sang. They played Autumn Leaves with a little more fire, a little more ache. Ruth took the melody, Marcus harmonized. The air between them was thick with memory, but also something new. Forgiveness with rhythm. After rehearsal, Elijah caught up to Marcus outside. "You planning to stay?" Marcus looked out over the quiet town. "I'm planning to stop running. That count?" Elijah clapped him on the shoulder. "It counts more than you know." The band grew tighter with each session. Marcus brought in pieces he'd written on the road, blues from Memphis, bossa novas from Atlanta dive bars, free jazz sketches on the backs of receipts. The band shaped them, gave them bones. But Ruth noticed something else. Marcus was listening now, really listening, not just to notes, but to people. He'd learned humility, maybe even peace. One evening, after a long improvisation, Marcus turned to her. "I wrote something for you," he said. "Not a song. A letter. The last one." He handed her a folded paper. "You don't have to read it, but I needed to give it to you, in person." She held it like glass. "Thank you." She read it alone in her apartment that night. "Ruth, I once said music made me a coward. I was wrong. Music's always been brave. I just wasn't ready to let it show me who I really was. But you did. You saw me, before I did. I don't expect anything. Just wanted you to know. The silence between us taught me more than any song ever could. Thank you for filling it with grace. Marcus." Tears came quietly. She folded the letter and placed it with the others. A symphony of apologies, a chorus of second chances,
and the first note of something new. Riverside didn't change overnight. The church was still crumbling, the roof still leaked, but the music inside swelled. With Marcus back, the basement became more than a sanctuary. It became a statement. They weren't just playing music, they were rewriting silence. Together.
Flyers had gone up across Riverside. One night only, the Basement Collective. In bold letters it read, "Music born of silence." Ruth had scribbled that tagline herself. The band rehearsed for weeks, pouring every ounce of heartache, redemption, and resilience into their set list. The church's old sanctuary was chosen for the venue. Reverend Carter, despite budget woes and leaking ceilings, cleared the pews and swept the dust. Marcus volunteered to paint the back wall black and hang string lights. "Mood matters," he said with a grin. Opening night arrived. Chairs filled with townsfolk, some curious, others skeptical. A few brought casseroles. Ruth, in a midnight blue dress, tuned her violin backstage, hands trembling. "First concert nerves?" Elijah asked, adjusting his tie. "First concert ever," she whispered. Malik drummed a soft rhythm on the wall. Marcus cracked his knuckles and nodded toward the stage. "Let's do this." The lights dimmed. Ruth stepped into the glow first, violin in hand. Then the rest followed. Malik behind the drums, Elijah on upright bass, Marcus with his tenor sax. Their eyes met, a breath held in collective suspense. Then music. Soft. A swell, like morning breaking over a weary town. They played their story, without words. Ruth's solos fluttered with pain and beauty. Elijah anchored them in rhythm. Malik's drumming spoke for every kid who'd ever been overlooked. And Marcus? His sax told the tale of coming home. The crowd sat silent, eyed wide. Some wept, some closed their eyes. It wasn't just a performance. It was healing. Midway, Ruth introduced a new composition, the Symphony of Silence. She raised her bow and the band followed. The piece opened with nothing, just stillness. Then, slowly, individual voices rose, plucked bass, soft snare, breathy saxophone, until they fused into something whole, something complete. At the final note, the silence returned. Sacred. The crowd held it before erupting into applause. Standing ovation, tears, laughter, whispers. I didn't know they could play like that. They could. And they did. After the show, the band gathered on the steps of the church. The night was warm, stars flickering. "We did it," Ruth said. Her voice, hoarse from emotion, was steadier than ever. Marcus leaned against the railing. "That wasn't just a concert, that was church." Malik nodded. "Think we could do it again?" Elijah laughed. "Think we have to." They didn't know what would come next. A second concert, a tour, maybe just another Tuesday rehearsal. But that night, they knew this. Music had saved them. And now, it might just save Riverside too.
The Monday after the concert, Riverside hummed with something new. It wasn't quite noise, it was resonance. In the bakery, on sidewalks, at the laundromat, people talked about it in hushed awe. "Did you hear Ruth play? The drummer, what's his name, Malik? He had magic in those hands." The buzz reached places it had never touched before. Mr. Donald, owner of the town's only record store, began displaying old jazz vinyls in his window again. Teachers at the high school asked if the Basement Collective might visit their classrooms. Even Councilman Price, known for grumbling about noise ordinances, asked Reverend Carter if the church could host another concert, strictly for the arts, of course. Meanwhile, Ruth returned to the basement not to rehearse, but to breathe. She walked the length of the dim room, ran her fingers over the scuffed floor, let silence fill her ears again. She needed it, because in silence she could still hear the music. Malik came by that afternoon with a notebook filled with scribbles. "I got rhythms, Ruth, stuff I dreamed about after the show, some wild syncopation ideas, like heartbeat patterns, but reversed." She smiled. "Let's hear them." They played, just the two of them, improvised, laughed. Ruth realized something then. The basement wasn't just where music was made, It was where they became music. Later that week, Marcus returned with news. Got a call. Some youth center in Greenville heard about us, wants us to come play, and maybe speak about how we came together. Elijah looked up from the sketchpad, surprised. Speak? Yeah, like inspire, whatever that means. Guess we better rehearse that part too, Ruth said, half joking. A week later, they piled into Marcus's borrowed van, instruments crammed in the back, nerves tucked between laughter and inside jokes. They arrived at the Greenville Youth Center to a crowd of teens, wide-eyed and skeptical. But when Ruth pulled her bow across the strings and Malik tapped a rhythm so raw it cracked the air, the skepticism dissolved. Music built a bridge where no words could. Afterward, the kids gathered around. One girl, maybe 15, asked, "You ever feel like no one hears you until you stop trying to talk?" Ruth nodded. "That's when I learned to play." That night, on the ride home, they sat quiet. The road hummed beneath the wheels. "What are we becoming?" Elijah asked. "A voice," said Marcus, "for everyone who thought silence was all they had." Ruth didn't answer. She didn't need to. She was already composing their next piece in her mind. It would begin in silence again, but not stay there long, because now the world was beginning to listen.
The weeks that followed brought new rhythms, not just musical ones. The group now had calendars pinned to the wall of the basement, scribbled with dates for small performances, visits to schools, and community workshops. Each time they played, the audience grew. Each time they shared their story, someone in the crowd cried or clapped too long or sat stunned by how silence had birthed something so loud with meaning. Ruth found herself hearing music differently. It wasn't just about melody and harmony. It was about the spaces in between, the rests, the pauses, the moments just before the bow kissed the string or Malik's stick struck the skin. "The silence is part of the music," she told the others one evening. "Without it, there's no contrast, no shape." Elijah nodded. "Like shadows in a painting." Marcus added, "Or breath in a speech." They grew more intentional with it. During one set at a civic hall, they played a composition Ruth titled Threshold. It began with 2 full minutes of silence. People shifted, coughed, looked uncomfortable, and then the music swelled in, rich and raw, and the discomfort transformed into awe. After the show, a woman in a red coat stopped Ruth. "Thank you," she said, tears in her eyes. "My son's deaf, but I could feel this tonight. You made sound optional." At the next rehearsal, Ruth shared a new idea. "What if we compose a full suite, something big, telling our whole journey, from silence to stage? Call it the Symphony of Silence." The room went still. Then Malik let out a soft, stunned laugh. "That's perfect." They divided the work. Ruth would lead the first and final movements. Marcus worked on a funk-infused interlude. Elijah sketched a sequence that would overlay spoken word with ambient strings. Malik's part was the heartbeat, a pulsing rhythm that would weave throughout the entire composition. They rehearsed late into the night. Some evenings they just sat together in the quiet, listening to old recordings, letting memory guide their hands. Mistakes became motifs. Forgotten bars returned as breakthroughs. In those long hours, they weren't just making music. They were telling a story no one had ever written before. One night, Ruth stayed behind after the others left. The basement hummed with aftersound, like ghosts of notes still dancing in the air. She placed her violin on the chair and walked to the wall where they'd taped up photos, snapshots of rehearsals, concerts, letters from students. Her fingers rested on the photo of their first concert. Below it, she wrote a single line. "Every silence we broke was once a fear we carried." Then she turned off the light and let the dark carry the weight of their music into the night.
The evening of the debut arrived. The concert hall, once a dream too grand to entertain, now pulsed with life. People filled the velvet seats, their whispers tangled with anticipation. From the mayor to students from the deaf school, from jazz historians to curious neighbors, Riverside had come to listen. But before the lights dimmed, Ruth stood backstage with her trio, Malik, Marcus, and Elijah. "This isn't just music," she whispered, gripping their hands. "It's a thank you note for every silence we survived." The curtains parted. The first movement opened with a hush, just a low hum from Malik's drum and a sustained violin note from Ruth, as if the orchestra itself were breathing in. Slowly, Marcus entered, weaving notes like memory through fog. Elijah followed, his saxophone moaning the ache of absence. Projected behind them were visuals, hand-drawn illustrations of their journey, the church basement, the alleyway, Ruth teaching young kids sign language beside sheet music. Each movement unfolded their story. The awakening, where Ruth heard her last true sound. Resonance, born in the basement shadows. The alley improv, where silence collided with sound. The letter, an orchestration of Marcus's written words. The threshold, echoing the silent beginning of their Civic Hall performance. And finally, the arrival, where all four stood at the edge of silence and poured themselves into every final note. The audience did not clap at first. They sat still, moved, breathless. And then a wave of applause erupted, not polite, not staged, raw, thunderous. Ruth blinked back tears, not from the sound of it, but from the weight, the meaning, the recognition of everything they had fought to articulate without words. Afterwards, Ruth stepped outside into the cold air behind the hall. Snow had begun to fall. Her breath rose like steam. She looked up at the sky, then closed her eyes. She heard nothing, and it was beautiful. In the silence, she felt every note that had led her here. Elijah joined her, hands in his coat pockets. Malik followed, then Marcus. They didn't have to. Together, they stood in the snowfall, quiet, whole. The symphony had ended, but their story would echo on.